your podcast and YouTube blog covering the German startup scene with news, interviews, and live events.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Joe from Startuprad.io, your startup podcast from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, bringing you top news and the legal framework behind it. Today, we will talk about the AI Act. Yes, it's a law. Yes, it's on a European level. And yes, it will impact the artificial intelligence that is used in software. Surprisingly, I do have I would say you're more a coder developer, entrepreneur from the US here as a guest, because that is basically what it gets down to, the development, the classification of AI, and we try to keep it as practical as possible. So, Andrew, I would like to welcome you to Startuprad.io.
Yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Joe.
My pleasure. As we said, you're not a lawyer. This is no legal advice here. This is just giving you a general idea. We may add here that the final effects of the AI Act come into force 2026. We're now the day before Halloween 2024. So it's a long way down the road, but you should take it already into account because it will have a massive implication. Can you tell us, Andrew, a little bit about you and how you got from cool stuff like coding into boring stuff like law?
Yeah. So my background is as a machine learning engineer, but one who's actually always been interested in the law. So I studied both politics and computer science. And then I worked actually for a while at a company that was using AI to analyze upcoming legislation and regulations. So my interest point actually in my test case was always looking at proposed regulations for AI itself. And I started to actually see some of the growing corpus of things develop over time, including actually the AI Act, when it was first introduced in 2021, was one of the big things that really drove my thinking. A lot of core components of that have remained the same. So I actually started thinking through how would my day-to-day as a machine learning engineer change as a result of regulations? What would I be doing differently? How would I be doing that differently? I'm really starting to think through what were the pain points there. One key thing actually is that the AI Act, I sometimes say, regulates more the people and the processes used to develop AI, more so than the technology itself. There's a few parts of that came in later in the negotiations. And so a big challenge a lot of organizations have is how to just coordinate between their technical and their non-technical teams now on some of these processes. That's what led me to co-found Trustable, an AI governance software company trying to help organizations easily and efficiently comply with a lot of regulations like the AI Act, like things coming out at the state level, and a lot of the different standards and frameworks coming out.
And that's the moment when a lot of our viewers and listeners have this aha moment. That's why you are here. Awesome. You've been talking about that the AI Act has been a long time in the making. It does have a little bit of history. Yep. It dates back to 2021. Would you say the success of OpenAI kind of accelerated what was going on there, that the European Union saw a need to regulate that? Admittedly, it's not only Germany that regulates here. There is also some regulation in the US as well.
Yep. Yeah, so the AI Act really actually originated as primarily a product safety law. And it was initially obviously a lot more probably focused on typical classification type, predictive analytic type AI. I think there have been, even before that point, a couple of notable incidents, both in the US and in the EU, of issues with computer systems causing a lot of harm. There's a lot of issues I know in the Netherlands with some benefits AI systems having a lot of biases towards certain groups. There's a lot of cases in the US of similar instances, including one where a system was being used to recommend different prison sentences and was found to have bias against certain demographics there as well. And so the whole idea of the origin of the law was to make sure that companies were implementing this kind of product safety mindset. And why I say that is that it really means organizations need to be responsible for the safety of what they're selling out into the market, and not simply say that it's your responsibility. You have to implement certain practices to make sure that your systems are safe for people and for society. Now, actually, if anything, the generative AI and ChatGPT almost killed the AI Act because there was suddenly a lot more concern about innovation. I think actually the AI Act would have passed even without ChatGPT and actually would have done so earlier. It was some of the negotiations from the EU Parliament late in the discussions to manage some of the new things that are coming out around generative AI that actually delayed the AI Act for a couple of months.
When I bet that the moment you talked about responsibility, liability in context of the US, a lot of entrepreneurs who are listening to this right now, the toenails started to roll back. Yeah. Before we get a little bit into that, we may also add, as we said, we're not a lawyer. This is called the AI Act, but this is not an act, not a law per se. All the entities, all the states within the European Union have to implement this one way or another into national law. So there will be more than 20 different versions of that. Also, countries in the European Economic Area, think about Norway, Switzerland, the United Kingdoms, they'll also have to have some kind of regulation like this. Plus, I do understand that President Biden also signed what is called an executive order. We're not going into details why this is different from a law, but it's also doing some, my understanding is similar regulations of AI as does the AI Act.
Yeah, the Biden's executive order was very focused on actually public sector and government use of AI because that's what the scope of an executive order can do. It did require and expect some testing using a kind of small law related to national security of some of the larger models. But actually, it's almost, while it imposed some similar kinds of procurement and different risk management things as the AI Act, they're actually covering different sectors because the AI Act is purely a commercial law. It's, again, product safety. And actually, it's not prescriptive almost at all around the use of AI by different EU member state governments or in a completely exempted national security. And actually, just last week, Biden signed another, technically it was a memo instead of an executive order, detailing what practices the US should implement for AI risk management on top of national security and military uses of AI. So I haven't seen anything on that front out of the EU or member states nearly as much.
We have to admit that the NATO always gives us a little bit more time to react in terms of military stuff, which is also not a topic here of Startuprad.io. But we will tell that we attended Digital Gipfel, where we've been listening to all the people giving their perspective on everything digital in Germany, including speeches by Chancellor Scholz, Vice Chancellor Habeck, and Minister Wissing. But the AI Act took basically center stage there because it was very important and everybody kind of starts to understand the implications of using AI from very simple stuff like writing automated emails to improving the efficiency of the national grid, to casting, for example, metals and stuff like this. So that was very interesting. And I have been attending one special panel there where the two ladies in charge of the AI Act, translating it into national law, basically talked. One of them was head of department where the AI Act, the EU law, is transformed into national law, which is not done by now. And the other lady was in charge of the Bundesnetzagentur, of the department that will be set up, which is not there, that will be enforcing the AI Act. So they could only talk about it in very general terms about this. But what stuck with me is first they learned their lesson from GDPR, so they don't want to hammer completely the innovations, as well as the fact that they want to encourage innovations, that I want to kind of give you swim lanes where to work in. Everybody who'd like to learn more, I have a small blog post about this panel down here on my blog as well. Andrew, now we get into the AI Act. My understanding is there's first a classification by risk according to what the AI does, what it is used for, plus there are explicit cases where it's forbidden to use AI, right?
Yep, that's correct. So the AI Act outlines several very specific use cases that are outright prohibited, and that part is actually already in effect. So already, I believe August, if anybody was using, let's say, a deliberately emotionally manipulative AI system, that's now technically prohibited. Although I'll point out that there can always be a gray area between what is kind of a manipulation system and what might be an AI trying to upsell you on a product, for example, and love to dive into that a little bit later. Underneath those prohibited systems, there's then certain classes of use cases that are designated as high risk. And I'll say probably the majority of the act, as it'll impact a lot of your listeners, will be for anything that's designated as high risk. That's things that could impact people's financial or health, different uses in critical infrastructure. Sometimes people talk about that there's a limited risk option. That's not quite accurate. Anytime you're using an AI that's interacting with people, you need to disclose that, and that can actually still be aligned with a high risk system. It could also be something that's then exempt entirely, which are other narrow procedural things, other things that don't fall into the category of high risk. Those are fundamentally unregulated, at least from the AI Act, although all other laws still apply. So like you still need to obey GDPR in relation to even low risk AI systems, other kinds of things like basic liability for fraud. If you say an AI can do something that it can't, you're still going to be covered under fraud regulations, even if it's not explicitly under the AI Act.
Yeah, that was, I have spent, quite some time, during my last stint at a big four company, working in forensics, and my devious mind then instantly, when I was seeing, what, for example, ChatGPT did, I was thinking, if I would be criminal, I would be doing X and Y. So that's already covered under the specific laws. What I've been looking also through, well, basically, we could call it steps or parts of a pyramid. The forbidden parts include stuff like real-time biometrics, exploiting disabled or causing harm, system for inferring attributes like political opinion, sexual orientation, and so on. And also stuff like social scoring, which is done in other countries, or scrapping CCTV footage to compile facial recognition databases. I do believe that is something that is already done in different countries across the world. And I do believe there are some let's call them agencies who are also doing that, and may not fall under this law.
Yeah, that was one of the big, again, discussion and negotiation points, is whether there should be certain law enforcement exemptions. And I believe now for a lot of like the facial recognition stuff, they added on, if there's specific things around sex trafficking, terrorism, there are exceptions allowed around that.
And everybody who's now listening to this, oh yeah, I don't need do that stuff. I don't need that. But you've been already highlighting a pretty easy case here. For example, you have a web shop, you get a new chatbot on it, and then it turns out this chatbot is crossing the border and manipulating people to upsell them. So even if you are using those tools, you have responsibility, but the main responsibility falls onto the people, the companies coding this AI, right?
So that's where there's a little bit of some gray area, especially in one of the challenges in trying to fit some of these new technologies and new structures into this product liability structure is that it can be unclear. If I am simply implementing a chatbot, but maybe it's connected with my own data through like a vector database, what is my liability versus what is maybe OpenAI's API liability around some of that stuff? It's still not always going to be clear. What counts as, in legal terms, a substantial modification for a system needs to be clarified, because I could add maybe just a few examples of something. If I'm prompt engineering, does that count as modifying the system? It is changing some of the weights under the hood. I am changing some of the parameters maybe of the system that I can control. But how then is that impacting my liability versus OpenAI's? Also understanding like what is the information that went into that and breakdown there, I think is something that needs to be clarified through some of those national laws, through some of the work from the EU AI office as well. Because I think it's going to be a fairly complex space, especially if you're looking at using like an open source system, like you download Llama 3, you want to use that. The liability there is going to be much more on you as the deployer, especially because you don't have a contractual obligation there. So that's where there's going to be a lot more attention, I think, in the years to come.
So that also means not only the people who are really under the hood are responsible, are doing stuff within the framework of the AI Act. You can be just simply by using prompts, right? Okay, this is pretty important because I do believe a lot of people are now around going into stuff like Reddit, Googling different versions of prompts and simply using them in their tools, and that may be in the future a potential liability here.
Yeah, well, it's definitely an area of potential exploits or attacks. There's already a lot of concern around the security systems and even the best systems that implement these strong guardrails. And Anthropic has talked a lot about the different things that they do there. It's still relatively easy to bypass these through simple prompt injections. It used to be as simple as saying, "Hey, ignore your safety guidelines," and then it will. There's still other easy ways of telling it to say the opposite of something. You can bypass a lot of filters, maybe by asking it to write something in German, then translate it into English, and then run that. You can avoid some of the filters that are looking for keywords in English, for example. So it's definitely an area of introducing new potential risks around some of those systems. Even then, again, where the liability falls on that is going to be very dependent, possibly on the use case and how you're deploying and setting it up, whether you're fine tuning it, how you're constructing that stuff. It is admittedly we recognize it's impossible for an organization like OpenAI to know every possible way an organization might use something. So from that perspective, it could be hard to say that they are responsible for everything. On the flip side, there's oftentimes going to be a huge amount of asymmetry between the capabilities and resources. OpenAI is partnered with Microsoft. They have virtually unlimited funding for stuff. They have models that are taking months to train, spending tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. To say that they own no liability and a 3-person startup owns all the liability for all the stuff that could happen, that's a really difficult problem to have. But on the flip side, yeah, how can OpenAI know every possible thing, control everything? Even some things that look high risk might have valid use cases. Maybe you're talking about different national security or law enforcement things, but that's a valid use case for law enforcement itself, even if you want to ban that from the public versions. That's what I think is going to be very complex in the short term, is how to walk that fine line, and who's even going to be deciding what these systems should be allowed to do or not.
Basically, you as an entrepreneur, because we mostly have entrepreneurs, investors, and executives here as listeners. On you, the burden will fall to define some policy, internal compliance regulations of what you can do and what you can't do. I mean, from very, very simple things like don't use any available large language model that you can just Google,
Yeah.
To stuff like you're not allowed to do this or that in prompts. I think that there'll be one of the things that will be coming up, right?
Yeah, and that's something that our platform actually helps with, is helping draft what is the policy you should have, what are some of the things you should consider, and really what are the best practices that you as perhaps a small company should be implementing in order to comply with stuff. And you will always be responsible for ensuring that your system is being tested. Maybe it is just testing your own prompts, ensuring that it's working. There's a lot of challenges even with these systems, like maybe you use the same prompt and you get a different answer every time. That sometimes the feature, sometimes that's the bug, depending on what you're trying to do. It's still going to be your responsibility for assessing that. One of the hardest things is that there will be a lot of updates to these systems. We've seen that as different things come up, OpenAI and Anthropic have added different guardrails, and that has led actually to decreases in some of those systems. So it's always going to be your responsibility as the deployer, to use the AI Act's terms, of having your own quality management system, where you're at least staying on top of the stuff that you can control, that you're being diligent about that. Users are still going to be reporting issues back to you. And there's this requirement on post-market monitoring. It's still going to be on you to be assessing those. You might need to report some of that back to OpenAI, but you still need to be tracking that information yourself. You can't offload all of those responsibilities necessarily.
And that also means in the future, there will be a new job called a prompt tester.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting stuff coming out around quality assurance and the stability of the answers of these systems. But also a lot of those prompt testers are this whole ecosystem of AI red teaming. And some of the, within the AI Act for general purpose, there's both standard general purpose models. There's also ones called general purpose models with systemic risk. Those are like the GPT-4, the really big models, the Claude 3 Opus. Those are ones that all require additional types of red teaming activities. Those are people who would come in and basically do various tests against those models, write up the reports. They're supposed to have a level of independence from the orgs doing that. That's going to become a burgeoning field. It's very similar to the idea of penetration testing and cybersecurity. We're also perceiving an audit around some sort of system, but that's something we're seeing be a fast developing field. And a lot of orgs want to apply that to high risk systems as well, although that's not strictly required for at least most use cases that are high risk under the AI Act.
High risk systems, they'll be defined in the respective laws. As you say, there will always be gray area and the forbidden systems. But I also do understand they're low to very low risk systems, and some of them are actually not regulated at all.
Yeah, that's correct. One thing I'll actually highlight is that the EU from the Commission level is constructing a new office. That office will be responsible for actually updating the definitions of things that are high risk. There's a mechanism for them to add other things into there, as well as prohibit different use cases. So even though each different member state will have its own organization overseeing the AI Act implementation, the definitions of high risk will still be more centrally controlled. And I do suspect that as more information comes out, they'll start to add more and more things to that list. And so we shouldn't expect the list currently in the legislation to stay fixed for much longer than probably the first 2 or 3 years that the act is in effect.
We also talked about, in terms of risk, there's also a definition of unacceptable risks in AI practices, manipulative or exploitative behavior. Do you think this will have an impact on especially like advertising targeting of people? Because at one point it makes sense to kind of target, to use an AI to advertise, to collect data and understand your customers better. But I also do understand that there should be a legal limit how to do that, and a special level on what you can and cannot do, even though I understand that a lot of advertisers right now are thinking, I would like to do everything possible.
Yeah, I was just actually reviewing the list of things. One of the prohibited actions is actually inferring the emotions of somebody based on certain contexts and using that for certain purposes. Again, I think there will definitely be certain ways that you could leverage that information for advertising that would then be considered inappropriate. Admittedly, I think advertising in the EU already looks very different than the US because of GDPR. You still need that root information to begin with. That's where the data governance aspects of the AI Act come into play even more so in regulating stuff. I think most companies had already left the EU who are doing anything resembling the prohibited practices. I think where there's some gray area, for example, though, is that EU citizen data could still end up in some of those systems still being used. There's a lawsuit from several companies in the EU right now against Clearview AI, which does do that scraping of facial recognition, and they have the data of EU citizens inside that data set. And that's where the extraterritorial aspects of the AI Act are going to become more complex over time, because people want more data for their systems. It's the single most important thing, and pulling that in is going to become a big international issue, I suspect, between different countries.
And I do understand it's almost impossible to keep you out of those databases. For example, you just need to make a visit of New York, and you'll be filmed by hundreds, maybe even thousands of cameras if you spend 1 or 2 weeks in the city, and they'll all go anywhere. If you just change flights on international airports, they may be not under the AI Act and so on and so forth. So basically, there will be circumstances where this will happen. We just talked about like the territorial reach of that, and you talked about the part that applies to everything abroad. Could you elaborate a little bit on that before we get into what do you expect from the EU and the US regulations going forward?
Yeah. So admittedly, GDPR actually probably had a larger extraterritorial scope because it was a fundamental rights law. It was enumerating certain privacy rights that EU citizens had, and they're claiming that those rights exist for those EU citizens regardless of how and where that they're operating on certain stuff, which is why you can, even an EU citizen can send a takedown request to other companies, and it had a large impact in the US. The AI Act might actually be a little bit more narrow in scope because it's really taking this product safety and commercial law. So admittedly, you're only really in scope of that if you are actively trying to sell your product inside the EU, or if anybody in the EU is buying your product through any of those mechanisms. The danger there is that there's entire companies that might say, hey, we completely do not sell to any entity in the EU. We don't allow anybody operating or working in the EU to use our stuff and firewall it off completely. That'd be one of the bigger fears around like the innovation, the market development part of that, because it will be a little bit easier to actually avoid the AI Act by simply not doing business with AI systems inside the EU than it was for probably GDPR.
My understanding right now, as I said, I'm neither a lawyer nor coder, is the regulations from right now enacted in the US, speaking about memo, executive order, and so on and so forth, and the basic ideas of the AI Act are more or less in sync right now. Is that true?
That's true in terms of several of the legislation proposed at the state level in the US, including one that passed earlier this year in Colorado, are fairly similar in that they identify certain high-risk use cases of AI. And they say we're going to impose certain requirements on them. Then the requirements that they're imposing are fairly similar to some stuff in the AI Act. Usually the number one thing is that they say organizations need to be accountable for certain risks of their systems. So they need to implement a risk management system. They need to say, hey, if this system hallucinates, here's what we think could happen. Here's how severe it is. And then document the mitigations that they have in place, and then get somebody in the org, particularly their legal team, to sign off and say those mitigations are sufficient. And a big thing as well is actually having proper responses to incidents that are happening. The EU, this is called post-market monitoring. In the US, it's usually just called like incident response. So making sure that customers are able to report any problems that they're having with the systems, that those reports are being looked at in a timely manner, that the system is being updated in response to that. Because we don't know everything that could happen from AI, it's more important to make sure that orgs are being diligent and responsible in responding to that kind of stuff, rather than being able to know about that all upfront right now.
We're now just at the beginning of the AI age, at the beginning of the regulation of AI. And I was wondering, you kind of live AI and AI regulation here. We also do have a lot of early stage entrepreneurs here. We have people responsible for larger organizations and so on and so forth. And many of them there's no question, will in the future implement some kind of tool, library, API, or anything else into the products related to AI. Is there kind of an approach you could recommend to them? For example, a very abstract, do this first, then that, then that, then that. And of course, as always, talk to your lawyers. And of course, as always, I think more or less the AI testing sounds like auditing of some kind of software. You also have to do that. But before you get into this, some more very general thoughts about when and how to apply and how to work with the potential risk involved here.
Yeah. So actually the first thing I recommend to a lot of teams is to think about documenting justifications of decisions made around your AI at every step along the way. In any sort of regulated context, having a paper trail of the decisions being made is one of the most important things. And if you do that from the beginning, you're saving yourself a lot of trouble at the end, where some organizations try and, like we say, retrofit compliance. They try and justify things after the fact. Oftentimes, responsible AI isn't just having a product that's like unbiased and tested. It's also about how you developed it. Did you engage with the right people along the ways? Were you testing the system? Did you say like, hey, here's our criteria for selecting which model to use. Determine that criteria first, do the evaluation, then you can make a justification around that. Oftentimes, implementing those things is what actually creates a lot of legal protections that you're doing. What we say is like good faith efforts to comply, good diligence around that. And the second part is realizing what some of the limitations of these systems are. There's a lot more work that needs to be done for transparency about these systems, and the AI Act does require that. You've done some studies and have evaluated which models are more transparent, but it's actually really important to understand maybe this model is not good at translation, or maybe I don't even know how good it is at translation because they didn't post a benchmark about its capabilities there. Maybe understanding, this data set doesn't have information about maybe medical papers that went into it. And so because I'm doing something related to the medical space, that might be riskier to use. All of those different things are understanding the limitations of systems. It's going to become really important because oftentimes the first thing entrepreneurs are looking at is like, what model to use? How am I going to set this up? How am I going to sell this to my customer? And then making sure that you are accurately describing what the limitations of your own system are that's embedded with that is going to be the number one thing.
Mm-hmm. And how to avoid risk, for example, I can now see in the future that you can simply just use the API of OpenAI and everything should be fine because it has strength there and weaknesses there. And so basically you would need to use a good enough or best tool for the respective duties that you assign to this software, to this library, to this API, right?
Precisely. We talk a lot about AI ethics. One of the hard things about that, and people always talk about, oh, we want unbiased AI. It's probably not possible for there to be unbiased AI because bias can be very subjective. I lived for a while in France actually growing up, and they actually constitutionally don't allow you to collect information about race or ethnicity. They actually deny that those are constructs, everyone should be equals and whatnot. But then that creates a lot of challenges there where you couldn't measure necessarily like the selection rates of algorithms against those categories. Versus in the US, now according to certain laws, you have to do that. Definitely use cases in insurance. There's some stuff in New York City around hiring. You have to look at whether you're accidentally selecting in your AI certain races or ethnicities above others and look for bias there. So that's what's going to make it really hard for a single model possibly to be optimized against all of those. And either there's going to be different models that have different ethical principles built into them. You need to decide which ones are appropriate for your use, or that we'll end up with a whole ecosystem of almost different ideologies, different philosophies, different ethical principles. We'll have a very competitive marketplace around that.
I personally do believe you'll never have any unbiased AI tools because every human being has any type of bias, and maybe just be that they are fanatic for chocolate. Every human being has this, and as long as we are coding those AIs, there'll be never an unbiased AI. So always keep that in mind. Andrew, there would be like a lot of more questions I would have for you, but we are running short on time. I'd first like to thank you very much for being here. Secondly, we will link your company website and your LinkedIn profile down here in the show notes. Can you give us like a very short pitch of what would be the use case for European companies using your tool?
Yeah. So one of the hardest things actually for a lot of large organizations in particular with AI regulations is that they don't even know where and how AI might be used inside their organization, which means you don't know your exposure to the different laws. So the first thing our tool helps you do is build up an inventory of your AI. That's your AI use cases, your AI models, your vendors, some of the data sets being used. We can actually help evaluate what documentation you need for each of those, help you conduct some of the risk assessments to understand what are the risks of my AI. We combine a lot of insights on top of that. The whole idea being that AI is a fast changing space. There might be new risks that emerge, whether it's new cyber attacks, new exploits, or also new recommended mitigations against some of those risks. We deliver that straight into our platform to help organizations actually be aware of, hey, I'm using a chatbot and there's an incident over here where a chatbot unfortunately convinced a teen to commit suicide. Maybe you should run this test to look for this, implement this mitigation in order to reduce this kind of risk. And we track all the different regulations around the world to help identify, hey, maybe there's a new requirement that's coming out of Canada that includes you to look at the environmental impact. And you haven't done that for some of these AI systems. So we can highlight that, keep you aware of that. The whole goal is to make staying on top of maintaining your AI systems as easy as possible, especially as either you have a lot of AI deployed in your org or you're having to comply with a lot of different laws. Our tool adds a lot of value. We're doing all of the heavy work on, I'll say, the mental workload of figuring out what you need to document, how to do so. We can integrate into your systems to help keep things in sync as well, really just to help anyone comply with all of these emerging regulations.
Great. Andrew, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you as a guest, and everybody who'd like to learn more, go down here in the show notes and there will be the links to his personal LinkedIn profile as well as the company website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
That's all, folks. Find more news, streams, events, and interviews at www.startuprad.io. Remember, sharing is caring.